Chapter 17, Goodfellow Makes a Stand. Having watched the Beamishes out of sight, Spittleworth hurried off to the guard's room, where he found Roach, keeping watch over the rest of the royal guard. The walls of the room were hung with swords and a portrait of King Fred, whose eyes seemed to watch everything that was happening. "They're growing restless, my lord," muttered Roach. "They want to go home to their families and get to bed." "And so they shall, once we've had a little chat," said Spittleworth, moving to face the weary and travel-stained soldiers. "Has anyone got any questions about what happened back in the marshlands?" he asked the men. The soldiers looked at one another. Some of them stole furtive glances at Roach, who'd retreated against the wall and was polishing a rifle. Then Captain Goodfellow raised his hand along with two soldiers. "Why was Beamish's body wrapped up before any of us could look at it?" asked Captain Goodfellow. "I want to know where that bullet went that we heard being fired," said the second soldier. "How come only 4 people saw this monster if it's so huge?" asked the third. Two general nods and muttered disagreement. "All excellent questions," replied Spittleworth smoothly. "Let me explain." And he repeated the story of the attack that he told Mrs. Beamish. The soldiers who'd asked questions remained unsatisfied. "I still reckon it's funny that a huge monster was out there and none of us saw it," said the third. "If Beamish was half-eaten, why wasn't there more blood?" asked the second. "And who, in the name of all that is holy," said Captain Goodfellow, "is Nobby Buttons?" "How do you know about Nobby Buttons?" blurted Spittleworth without thinking. "On my way here from the stables, I bumped into one of the maids, Hetty," said Goodfellow. "She served you your wine, my lord. According to her, you've just been telling Beamish's poor wife about a member of the Royal Guard called Nobby Buttons. According to you, Nobby Buttons was sent with a message to Beamish's wife, telling her he'd been killed." "But I don't remember a Nobby Buttons. I've never met anyone called Nobby Buttons, so I ask you, my lord, how can that be? How can a man ride with us and camp with us and take orders from your lordship right in front of us without any of us ever clapping eyes on him?" Spittleworth, just like yesterday, Spittleworth's first thought was that he'd have to do something about that eavesdropping maid. Luckily, Goodfellow had given him her name. Then he said in a dangerous voice, "What gives you the right to speak for everybody, Captain Goodfellow? Perhaps some of these men have better memories than you do. Perhaps they remember poor Nobby Buttons clearly. Dear little Nobby, in whose memory the king will add a fat bag of gold to everyone's pay this week. Proud, brave Nobby, whose sacrifice, for I fear the monster has eaten him as well as Beamish, will mean a pay raise for all his comrades in arms. Noble Nobby Buttons, whose closest friends are surely marked for a speedy promotion." Another silence followed Spittleworth's words, and this silence had a cold, heavy quality. Now the whole royal guard understood the choice facing them. They weighed in their minds the huge influence Spittleworth was known to have over the king, and the fact that Major Roach was now caressing the barrel of his rifle in a menacing manner. And they remembered the sudden death of their former leader, Major Beamish. They also considered the promise of more gold and speedy promotion if they agreed to believe in the Ickabog and in Private Nobby Buttons. Goodfellow stood up so suddenly that his chair clattered to the floor. "There never was a Nobby Buttons, and I'm darned if there's an Ickabog, and I won't be party to a lie." The other 2 men who'd asked questions stood up as well, but the rest of the royal guard remained seated, silent, and watchful. "Very well," said Spittleworth. "You 3 are under arrest for the filthy crime of treason. As I am sure your comrades remember, you ran away when the Ickabog appeared. You forgot your duty to protect the king and thought only of saving your own cowardly hides. The penalty is death by firing squad. He chose 8 soldiers to take the 3 men away, and even though the 3 honest soldiers struggled very hard, they were outnumbered and overwhelmed, and in no time at all, they'd been dragged out of the guard's room. Very good, said Spittleworth to the few soldiers remaining. Very good indeed. There will be pay raises all around, and I shall remember your names when it comes to promotions. Now, don't forget to tell your families exactly what happened in the marshlands. It might bode ill for your wives, your parents, and your children if they are heard to question the existence of the Ickabog or of knobby buttons. You may now return home. Chapter 18, End of an Advisor. No sooner had the guardsmen got to their feet to return home than Lord Flapoon came bursting into the room looking worried. What now? Groaned Spittleworth, who very much wanted his bath and bed. The chief advisor, panted Flapoon, and sure enough, Herringbone, the chief advisor, now appeared wearing his dressing gown and an expression of outrage. I demand an explanation, my lord, he cried. What stories are these that reach my ears? The Ickabog? Real? Major Beamish? Dead? And I've just passed 3 of the king's soldiers being dragged away under sentence of death. I have, of course, instructed that they may be taken to the dungeons to await trial instead. I can explain everything, Chief Advisor, said Spittleworth with a bow. And for the 3rd time that evening, he related the tale of the Ickabog attacking the king and killing Beamish. Then the mysterious disappearance of Knobby Buttons, who Spittleworth feared had also fallen prey to the monster. Herringbone, who'd always deplored the influence of Spittleworth and Flapoon on the king, waited for Spittleworth to finish his farrago of lies with the air of a wily old fox who waits at a rabbit hole for his dinner. A fascinating tale, he said when Spittleworth had finished. But I hereby relieve you of any further responsibility in the matter, Lord Spittleworth. The advisors will take charge now. There are laws and protocols in Cornucopia to deal with emergencies such as these. Firstly, the men in the dungeons will be given a proper trial so that we can hear their version of events. Secondly, the lists of the king's soldiers must be searched to find the family of this Knobby Buttons and inform them of his death. Thirdly, Major Beamish's body must be closely examined by the king's physician so that we may learn more about the monster that killed him. Spittleworth opened his mouth very wide, but nothing came out. He saw his whole glorious scheme collapsing on top of him, and himself trapped beneath it, imprisoned by his own cleverness. Then Major Roach, who was standing behind the chief advisor, slowly put down his rifle and took a sword from the wall. A look like a flash of light on dark water passed between Roach and Spittleworth, who said, I think, Herringbone, that you are ripe for retirement. Steel flashed, and the tip of Roach's sword appeared out of the chief advisor's belly. The soldiers gasped, but the chief advisor didn't utter a word. He simply knelt, then toppled over, dead. Spittleworth looked around at the soldiers who'd agreed to believe in the Ickabog. He liked seeing the fear on every face. He could feel his own power. Did everybody hear the chief advisor appointing me to his job before he retired? He asked softly. The soldiers all nodded. They just stood by and watched murder and felt too deeply involved to protest. All they cared about now was escaping this room alive and protecting their families. Very well then, said Spittleworth. The king believes the Ickabog is real, and I stand with the king. I am the new chief advisor, and I will be devising a plan to protect the kingdom. All who are loyal to the king will find their lives run very much as before. Any who stand against the king will suffer the penalty of cowards and traitors, imprisonment or death. Now, I need one of you gentlemen to assist Major Roach in burying the body of our dear chief advisor, and be sure and put him where he won't be found. The rest of you are free to return to your families and inform them of the danger threatening our beloved cornucopia. Chapter 19, Lady Eslanda. Spittleworth now marched off toward the dungeons. With Herringbone gone, there was nothing to stop him killing the 3 honest soldiers. He intended to shoot them himself. There would be time enough to invent a story afterward. Possibly, he could place their bodies in the vault where the crown jewels were kept and pretend they'd been trying to steal them. However, just as Spittleworth put his hand on the door to the dungeons, a quiet voice spoke out of the darkness behind him. Good evening, Lord Spittleworth. He turned and saw Lady Eslanda, raven-haired and serious, stepping down from a dark spiral staircase. You're awake late, my lady, said Spittleworth with a bow. Yes, said Lady Eslanda, whose heart was beating very fast. I couldn't sleep. I thought I'd take a little stroll. This was a fib. In fact, Eslanda had been fast asleep in her bed when she was woken by a frantic knocking on her bedroom door. Opening it, she found Hetty standing there, the maid who'd served Spittleworth his wine, and heard his lies about Nobby Buttons. Hetty had been so curious about what Spittleworth was up to after his story about Nobby Buttons that she'd crept along to the guard's room, and by pressing her ear to the door, heard everything that was going on inside. Hetty ran and hid when the 3 honest soldiers were dragged away, then sped upstairs to wake Lady Eslanda. She wanted to help the men who were about to be shot. The maid had no idea that Eslanda was secretly in love with Captain Goodfellow. She simply liked Lady Eslanda best of all the ladies at court, and knew her to be kind and clever. Lady Eslanda hastily pressed some gold into Hetty's hands and advised her to leave the palace that night because she was afraid the maid might now be in grave danger. Then Lady Eslanda dressed herself with trembling hands, seized a lantern, and hurried down the spiral staircase beside her bedroom. However, before she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard voices. Blowing out her lantern, Eslanda listened as Herringbone gave the order for Captain Goodfellow and his friends to be taken to the dungeons instead of being shot. She'd been hiding on the stairs ever since because she had a feeling the danger threatening the men might not yet have passed. And here, sure enough, was Lord Spittleworth heading for the dungeons with a pistol. Is the chief advisor anywhere about? Lady Eslanda asked. I thought I heard his voice earlier. Herringbone has retired, said Spittleworth. You see standing before you the new chief advisor, my lady. Oh, congratulations, said Eslanda, pretending to be pleased, although she was horrified. So it will be you who oversees the trial of the 3 soldiers in the dungeons, will it? You're very well informed, Lady Eslanda, said Spittleworth, eyeing her closely. How did you know there are 3 soldiers in the dungeons? I happened to hear Herringbone mention them, said Lady Eslanda. They're well-respected men, it seems. He was saying how important it will be for them to have a fair trial. I know King Fred will agree because he cares deeply about his own popularity, as he should, for if a king is to be effective, he must be loved. Lady Eslanda did a good job of pretending that she was thinking only of the king's popularity, and I think 9 out of 10 people would have believed her. Unfortunately, Spittleworth heard the tremor in her voice and suspected that she might be in love with one of these men, to hurry downstairs in the dead of night in hope of saving their lives. "I wonder," he said, watching her closely, "which one of them it is whom you care about so much?" Lady Islanda would have stopped herself blushing if she could, but unfortunately she could not. "I don't think it can be Ogden," mused Spittleworth, "because he's a very plain man, and in any case he already has a wife. Might it be Wagstaff? He's an amusing fellow, but prone to boils." "No," said Lord Spittleworth softly. "I think it must be handsome Captain Goodfellow who makes you blush, Lady Islanda. Would you really stoop so low? His parents were cheesemakers, you know." "It makes no difference to me whether a man is a cheesemaker or a king, so long as he behaves with honor," said Islanda, "and the king will be dishonored if those soldiers are shot without trial, and so I'll tell him when he wakes." Lady Islanda then turned, trembling, and climbed the spiral staircase. She had no idea whether she'd said enough to save the soldiers, so she spent a sleepless night. Spittleworth remained standing in the chilly passage until his feet were so cold he could barely feel them. He was trying to decide what to do. On the other hand, he really did want to get rid of these soldiers who knew far too much. On the other hand, he feared Lady Islanda was right. People would blame the king if the men were shot without trial. Then Fred would be angry at Spittleworth and might even take the job of chief advisor away from him. If that happened, all the dreams of power and riches that Spittleworth had enjoyed on the journey back from the marshlands would be dashed. So Spittleworth turned away from the dungeon door and headed to his bed. He was deeply offended by the idea that Lady Islanda, whom he had once hoped to marry, preferred the son of cheesemakers. As he blew out his candle, Spittleworth decided that she would pay one day for that insult. We shall stop there.